Welcome to Channeling Carrington, celebrating the legacies of Leonora. Leonora Carrington was born on this day in 1917. She would have been 106 today. My name is Wendi Norris, and I am the founder of Gallery Wendi Norris. I'm headquartered here in San Francisco. And my gallery has had the honor, as we know, to have worked with Carrington and her work for 20 years. So we're excited to produce tonight's celebratory event with this stellar cast. Before I turn this over to our incredible moderator, Laeticia Barbier, I just wanted to do a plug for our two scholars and panelists today. This is the book that inspired tonight's discussion by Catriona McAra. It's available via Manchester University Press. They've been really gracious in allowing all of our viewers a 30% discount. So it can be used at checkout. It's McAra 30. So please, if you like what you hear and you want to read more, it's extraordinary. Also, the Tarot of Leonora Carrington. It may be a little bit harder to find, but I know the Fine Arts Museum here in San Francisco is carrying it, and museums around the world are carrying it. I am trying to get people to go somewhere other than Amazon, but if you must, it is also on Amazon. One thing also of note, I just came back from Madrid not that long ago, where I saw the most incredible exhibition of Carrington's that I've seen in 20 years. It has, I think, 188 works on the view. It's at the Fundación Mafra. It's called Revelation. And if you can't make it in person, I have been told Susan Aberth's review of the exhibition will be available in next month's art forum. So I'm sure it's going to provide an excellent window into the Carrington exhibition on view in Madrid. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to a real bright light in the world of art and tarot, a magician in her own right, Laeticia Barbier. Thank you, lady, for agreeing to be here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Wendi, and thank you to all the Wendi Norris team for putting up this event. I'm very excited to be able to address those two amazing speakers. I just wanted to say this before. It's like I did actually pull the card before the show. And I pulled a magician, which might explain some of the mercurial trickster energy of the technology today. But so like we're going to start with Catriona. I was going to do a presentation. Dr. Catriona McAra is a lecturer in modern and contemporary art history at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. And of course, our most recent book is this beauty, The Medium of Leonora Carrington, Feminist Hunting in Contemporary Art. Please give a warm round of silent applause for Catriona.
Thank you so much, Leti. It's wonderful to see you again. I so enjoyed your tarot course a few years ago. I really recommend it to you all, Death and Resurrection. Absolutely brilliant. That's how I learned all about the tarot. And I first met Susan, wonderful Susan Aberth, who's joining us in a moment. Here's her book. I first met her at Chichester at Edward James's house. That was back in 2010, and she was kind enough to encourage my thinking on Leonora. And we've had many adventures together since then. So it's wonderful to be in conversation with her tonight as well. And also to Wendi Norris. I've known you, Wendi, since 2013. And you know, you've always been such a firm believer in the importance of scholarly research for exhibition making and interpretation. And thank goodness for you and your brilliant team. And I start by saying this because I come to this discussion from the firm conviction that Carrington has this marvelous synchronistic way of bringing people together, often in spite of the odds, as we've seen tonight. So thank you all, audience members, for being here too, and for your patience. So my book has had quite a long gestation. In 2011, I was finishing a PhD thesis at the University of Glasgow on one of Leonora's contemporaries, Dorothea Tanning, who was the subject of my first book. And I'd met Tanning in 2008 during my research. So I thought I better try and meet Carrington too. You know, given that I already knew I wanted to write a second book on her. So in that very kind of lackadaisical student way, I started vaguely thinking about saving or applying for a grant that would get me to Mexico City, with no particular sense of urgency, unfortunately. I thought she was one of these non-agenarian women who was going to live forever. I think we all did. And then one day in May 2011, she died, and it really knocked me sideways. I mean, I physically fainted upon hearing the news, which I received via text message from a colleague. And other people have reported similar, that they felt similar upon hearing the news of her passing. So I had to shift the thinking quite radically in terms of what the book was going to be and how I was going to write about Carrington now that she was no longer with us in person. I was hell-bent on doing so. And the project obviously became about meeting people like Susan and like Wendi who did know her, and to explore her through other people's encounters. So I wonder if we can have the first slide. Gabby, is that possible? Yes, thank you very much. So here I'm showing you two members of the Aretis family, a literary family of poets, novelists, and screenwriters and translators, and they're all environmental activists as well. Here are the two sisters flanking Leonora. So my project brought me very close to Chloe Aretis, who is the woman on the left holding the blue bird staff. My fourth chapter of my book considers how Leonora figures or haunts Chloe's three novels to date: Book of Clouds of 2009, Asunder of 2013, and Sea Monsters of 2019, as well as the docu-fiction psychothriller Female Human Animal of 2018, which stars Chloe as the leading character while she curates the real-life Tate Liverpool exhibition of 2015. And so my book is very interested in what I term the esoteric curation of Carrington. And I was actually able to realize a small show of her prints myself in 2016, thanks to a very dear friend, Victor Wind. Gabby, if we can maybe have the next slide. It continues. The Scottish actor and artist Tilda Swinton is also a fan of Leonora Carrington. And I know this because she visited Wendi Norris's fantastic Story of the Last Egg exhibition in New York in 2019, which I was also lucky enough to catch. And many of you may already be familiar with this forensically well-researched fashion story, which Swinton collaborated with Tim Walker on for ID magazine in 2017 to celebrate Leonora's centenary. And this particular image on the left, which I was lucky enough to be able to use on the cover of my book, seems to toy with the mythologization of Carrington's iconic status as a muse for the next generation, the daughter of the Minotaur, or the daughter of surrealism for that matter, as a kind of horned demigoddess. I know this has been read in all sorts of other interesting ways too. Carrington, of course, famously declared that she didn't have time to be anyone's muse, but maybe she does now. And I think you're definitely cool if Tilda Swinton selects you as their muse. And the curator and scholar Natasha Boas once said that Carrington is current, and that definitely seems to be the case here. I could talk about Tilda Swinton for hours, by the way, but just to say briefly that in my view, Swinton and Carrington are uniquely similar or similarly different, if that paradox makes sense to you at this time. Swinton has been described as arguably the greatest chameleon of her generation. She's Sphinx-like with a blank canvas of a face, so a versatility which allows her to morph and shapeshift apparently effortlessly between ages, genders, and genres, from the conceptual icon to queer enchantress. And so for a thespian like Swinton, witches offer habitual character studies, while the corporate suit presents an experimental challenge that tests the limits of her skill set. And of course, Leti would always ask us in class, which tarot card does this remind you of? And I wonder if maybe it's the Empress card in this case. Maybe we can discuss that later. But there's also something quite trickster-like about Carrington, which I think we see with the next artist I want to show you. So Gabby, if we can just have the next slide on screen. So the Glasgow-based conceptual artist Lucy Scare took my project in quite a different direction. She describes Leonora as the wild card in her practice, a disassembling force which encourages viewers to rethink their visual categories. My presentation tonight is broadly iconographical comparisons, but Scare's work proposes that Carrington's very coexistence with Scare's own lifetime can offer perhaps a much more conceptual framework for artists to use as a kind of toolkit or backbone or a kind of critical framework. So I became quite intrigued by the possibility of a conceptual Carrington, especially given her little known friendship with Marcel Duchamp that doesn't often get mentioned in the literature. And I wrote this chapter on the esoteric mode of curation because what became apparent to me, especially in light of Susan and Tere Arcq's recent work, is the unmistakable position of tarot as an organizing principle, curation as divination. Scare also favors a Venn diagram for these chance encounters, but she names individual components of her Leonora cycle after tarot cards. So I thought it'd be relevant to bring to attention tonight. So on the left here, we have Leonora the Joker, 16mm film of the artist's hands. Other aspects of the cycle, which you can see in the image on the right, include an infinite black swirl drawing, which is almost kind of mimicking a whale skeleton, which is entitled Death. So it's the Death card. We also have an abalone encrusted antique table, which is entitled The Tyrant, or the Emperor, and a split wooden amphitheater, which you can see on the floor there, which is entitled The Wheel. So again, Leti and Susan can tell us later what pulling the Fool, the Tyrant and the Wheel might mean as a triptych. Scare met Leonora in 2006 based on what she calls a whim and some late night internet booking, which I think throws Leonora's own transatlantic transition to Mexico into stark relief. And I became interested in the idea that Scare might ultimately de-romanticize and de-exoticize Carrington's traveling. And Leti once told me that the Fool in tarot is both everywhere and nowhere. It doesn't have a passport. And I think that is very apt in this case. But if we can have the next slide now, Gabby, the notion of the pilgrimage or medieval quest certainly became the case for so many members of the growing Leonora fan club. This is the Ukrainian-Canadian novelist and fashion designer Heidi Sapinka, whose practice is also explored in chapter 4 of my book. And here she is on the right in the red dress in Mexico City with her friends, and she's recreating some of Leonora's compositions in an attempt to try and summon or channel her. Sapinka then interviewed Carrington for The Believer magazine and fictionalized her life in her novel, The Dictionary of Animal Languages, 2018, which I discuss in the book in terms of creative solitude and hibernation as vitally important, though often overlooked phases in the creative cycle, especially for women who are less often granted these rights without a major guilt trip of some kind. So Carrington is rechristened Ivory Frame, an animal painter turned biologist, which has a kind of marvelous, believable logic within the novel. And if we can move to the next slide, Gabby. Ivory actually creates this painting on the left as a submission for her still life brief, and it's rejected by her tutors. And this is a quote, "A banquet of cannibals, a blasphemous take on the Eucharist." That's how she describes it. So it's this idea of the rejection by the establishment is a constant theme in my book too, as well as the critical need to resist institutionalization. And this is something that the very great scholar Natalia Lusty once advised me about, and I think it's totally true. You know, I want my students to identify as feminists, but we need to be mindful of commodification. So this need to go feral continues in chapter 5 of my book with the work of Lynn Liu and Samantha Sweeting. Samantha Sweeting here pictured on the right. Here you see a carnal scene recreated by Sweeting. Her practice is very much a form of embodied storytelling. She's a part-time farmer and has a long-term interest in the childhood imagery of Carrington, as well as spotlighting themes of empathy, well-being, and grief. So Carrington's compositions serve a psychotherapeutic function here as a kind of memento mori to manage the loss of a friend. And Gabby, if we can just have the final slide now, or the second to last slide. A performative rewilding continues again in the work of double-edged theatre. They also went through a Leonora cycle. So that included the indoor production, The Magician and the Teacher of 2018, and the outdoor harvest performance, Leonora's World, which I witnessed in their eco farmland in Ashfield in rural Massachusetts in 2019. And that was directed by the extraordinary Stacey Klein in the wake of and as a response to Hillary Clinton's concession speech of 2016. So choosing a creative woman with Latin American associations as their figurehead. And I became interested in the work of the trapeze artist in the ensemble, Cariel Klein. Double-edged speak of their circus techniques as flying. So for me, Cariel embodies what Donna Haraway has termed the boundary creature, an imaginative hybrid species which Carrington seems to infinitely conjure in both her paintings and writings. And here, just as a comparison, I'm showing you 999, which I think has a really interesting frantic sense of urgency and horizontality about it. And here, I just want to acknowledge another boundary creature who's in the book in the introduction, and that's Kim Pace, who's an English animator and ceramicist, and she really equipped me with the conceptual tools to see this boundary creature. And then, Gabby, if we just move to the final slide. I just want to make the point that Carrington's work is not exclusive to creative women, nor should it be. This is on the right, the work of Cynthia Nazubi, who's a Black South African California-based artist who made this amazing painting assemblage in homage to Carrington. And he named it after her short story, As They Rode Along the Edge, featuring the chariot-riding mountain woman, Virginia Furr. And I think it also echoes the unicyclist in the work on the left here, I Am an Amateur of Velocipedes, which has been a really important artwork for numerous artists, given that until very recently, it was one of the few artworks that was available for consultation in public collections. So in total, ultimately, the book is kind of suggesting that Carrington has become a successful medium herself for new generations of artists and writers. All the individuals I focus on in the book are mid-career professional artists and writers, but I've tried to bring in more voices, as many voices as possible in the interview appendix towards the end of the book in order to broaden the conversation. And I was really honoured to have interviews with Wendi and Susan as part of that, just about their work in the Carrington universe. So really hoping to see Susan now and hear from her. Thank you for listening to me.
It was my fault that we started late, so I will be extra quick and maybe even a little shorter in my presentation. So please forgive me.
Susan, would you mind if I introduce you first? Very little to introduce, but I'm just, please welcome Susan Aberth, who's the Edith C. Bloom Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at Bart's College in Amandale on Hudson. And she's also the author, as we've plugged that book, but it's just so beautiful. The revisited version is so incredible. So please give a warm welcome to Susan.
I'll start at the beginning. In 2018, my dear colleague and co-author of this book, Tere Arcq in Mexico, called me and told me she had discovered Leonora Carrington's Major Arcana deck. I almost fainted. I flew down, and as we stood there looking at it, we knew that this was a big deal, that it was going to change everything about how we looked at Carrington. And we immediately began working on a book, and then the pandemic hit. Archives were closed, travel was impossible, printing and shipping were difficult. It was kind of a nightmare, but our first edition, the Tarot of Leonora Carrington, came out in 2021 with Fulgur Press of England. So this was wonderful, but we knew that a lot more had to go into the book, and we began to work all over again. We conducted further research, we doubled the text, we added many more images, and we are happy to say the second edition is out this year from RM Verlag in Spain, and it's available in Spanish in addition to English. Can I have the next? Image, please. So what is different in this new edition? A lot, actually. It's part of a magical practice to create one's own implements. So we surmise that these cards contained Carrington's esoteric worldview, and actually they do. They are keys to much of her large body of visual and written work. And we immediately began to make some serious connections all around. In particular, we looked at her color symbolism, which differs dramatically from traditional tarot decks. The only two dated cards in the deck are here, the Magician and the High Priestess. So that made us look at the role that gender played throughout the deck. And that was a very fruitful avenue of exploration. Next. Next, yeah, thank you. Then we delved into her relationship with her adopted country of Mexico. And this aspect of her work is often neglected. And I just want to say here that working with my colleague Tere Arcq in Mexico, it's a very wonderful collaboration. And we really believe in the collaboration intellectually between women, and we can cover a lot of different bases. So as we began to look at the rich past and present and collections of Mexican art, we saw some important things, particularly in Carrington's use of color: red, black, green, turquoise. All of these colors had very specific meanings, particularly in Mesoamerican religions. Now, Carrington was a member of the intellectual elite of Mexico. She was close friends with writers, anthropologists, archaeologists, and at times she even accompanied them on their research expeditions. And she had a very avid intellectual interest in their work. Next, please. So another remarkable discovery that was made while we were writing was the original painting for Carrington's well-known poster, Mujeres Conciencia, which you see here all the way to the upper left. On the back of this painting, we found an inscription, and I'll read it for you. Winged Siwacoatl, snake woman, equals Quetzalcoatl, sacred serpent. Hermaphrodite rises again in the tree of life, where Eve gives Eve back the fruit of wisdom. Women take back the original wisdom. Well, that was a very instructive quote. And we realized that she was taking a closer look at Mesoamerican mythology, more so than we even thought. And Siwacoatl in the Mexica pantheon is a deity of gender duality and witchcraft, and she is the equal to Quetzalcoatl. And she's often shown, as you can see here on a codex, in the bottom left square. She's often shown with a red and black bands on her, color bands on her face. And she carries masculine and feminine attributes, a weapon and a loom in this particular case. So Carrington's blending of genders, the blending of male and female, was one of the solutions to gender equity in our future. And this theme runs throughout the deck. Next, please. Another, I think, very important contribution of this book to scholarship is the discovery of two diagrams. And in fact, they're the only two diagrams we have by the artist which fleshes out her esoteric ideas. On the right is kind of a color chart in the form of a Gurdjieff enneagram. And it has specific meanings she attributes to colors. And we then place this onto the colors used on the deck. On the left is a wonderful thing called the Map of the Human Animal, and it is also full of esoteric notations. And in the center above is the sacred androgen, which is male and female, black and red, just like the magician and the high priestess I showed you before, blended together. Next two. Next image, please. Then we spent a lot more time on each card. We hadn't been able to do this previously. And again, our research gave us some really interesting surprises. We found out through interviewing some of her friends that she was she valued greatly the work of the French occultist, Eliphas Levi. And she owned his books, she took notes on the books, and therefore her devil card we could specifically align with his depiction or his discussion of Baphomet. And Baphomet was a very important image to him. He felt that it was an androgynous harbinger of the future when there would be no distinction between the sexes. Now we think of it as associated with Satanism, but really it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. And next, and on my last image. And finally, there is a greater discussion of alchemy and her use of gold and silver leaf on some of the cards. And she uses these not only as a medium, but also as a magical material associated with many different religions. And I just want to end and say this. Carrington did not do tarot readings for people. That was not her interest. Instead, she used tarot for something else. And I'll end with a quote from Jodorowsky, who she was very close with and whom she taught tarot. And she told him, and I quote, "Each arcana is a mirror and not a truth in itself, because become what you see in it. The tarot is a chameleon."
Thank you so much, Susan. It's so fascinating. I'm so grateful to have you both, for myself a little bit and have you for a couple of questions. I have to say that I was very lucky to be able to spend the last week reading both of your book back to back. And I really recommend that as an experience. if everyone could do it, spending 10 days in the Leonora verse. I thought the books function so beautifully together. Your book, Susan, because it really details so greatly how Leonora used a very fixated system and then kind of make it her own. And then I felt like Catriona's book talks about Leonora as a mystery school herself and how people kind of reclaimed her and then made her their own. So my first question is for you, Susan. You ended with that note, which I thought was so beautiful, that quote I didn't know. Well, I know about tarot. I know more about tarot than Leonora Carrington, but when I was looking through the book, I felt like there is such an interesting commonality between the very old, very fixated image of tarot, who are more than 5 centuries old. The first decks came in the Renaissance, and then the images of Leonora Carrington. I felt like the one of the thing that linked them is their ambiguity, the fact that in both your books, you talk very beautifully about how she kind of rejected every formulaic interpretation of her work, and she was really against it. And tarot really functioned the same way over those 5 centuries, even though the tarot was not always a divination tool. The images meant different things, from the philosophical allegory of the Renaissance to now what we see in them. And so my first question, which is very long, so I apologize. First question, which is also in 2 tiers for you, Susan. When Leonora was practicing and studying the tarot, what function did the tarot artistically had for her? And what I want to learn about is how did it invite her to a different process of scrying through images in general, and how that galvanized the own ambiguity she tried to play in her work. And then the other fold of my question, which I'm going to put everything in your arms and then you answer the way you want, is like I wanted to know how permeable her other work, her non necessarily tarot work, is of, I want to say, tarot archetypal forces, not necessarily the visual motif, but those very strong energy that the tarot carries within it. And that's the end of my question.
That's a really big bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to keep a thread throughout them. So when I wrote my first book on Carrington, I really focused on alchemy as the organizing principle throughout her work. And lo and behold, when Tere and I began to really look into the deck, we discovered, actually to our shock, because we had been studying her for decades, that no, it was the tarot that connected everything. Tarot was a kind of open net, which she kind of threw onto all of her different esoteric interests. And she was very well read in the tarot and in esotericism in general. And as we looked at all of her paintings, and then we went to her texts, particularly the Stone Door, we saw that everywhere were subtle tarot allusions. And we try to collect them in the book. They're in portraits, they're in theatrical productions, again, just pervasively through everything. But you brought up something about scrying, the notion of looking into the card as a mirror and finding oneself psychologically, spiritually. And I just want to state very strongly that I think that's the key to Carrington's work in general. You see what you're meant to see at that particular moment of your consciousness. A year later, you're going to see something very different. And I know my experience with tarot cards, that's definitely true. And I'm sure it is with yours as well. So I hope I answered that question.
Beautifully. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to Catriona. Which book I've finished a couple of days ago, and it was just such an amazing adventure to read your book, Catriona. I was just so fascinated. One of the things that I really loved about it is the honesty in which you talk about your own and I guess our own fandom of Leonora Carrington, how we are. And then it also like how beautifully you try to dissolve the myth around her and the romance, and like you talk about how there is this phenomenon of possession almost about that we seem to have with her, and she seemed to be like such an important cultural phenomenon, but yet you also give such an important credit, and you don't how can I say that, you don't play down the actual influence she has on contemporary artists, and so when I was thinking about your book, and this whole idea of mystery school was like very interesting and fun to me, even if she might probably have hated that. And I was wondering, like, throughout your interviews and the people you connected with, what are the most important lessons or tenets that people actually learn from her throughout their own ownership or possession of Leonora?
I mean, Carrington is kind of a belief system in her own right. Yeah. The interview process was really like the game of the exquisite corpse. I always got something new out of talking to people, even though I was pretty much asking the same set of questions. So I was certainly intrigued by which particular artworks or stories everyone was most drawn to. And it might come as no surprise to our audience that the most frequently cited of those literary works were Down Below of 1944 and The Hearing Trumpet of 1974. And her most popular artwork in those conversations was The House Opposite, 1945, which I thought was very interesting. And if it doesn't clog up the chat, I would love to know what everyone's favorite Carrington artwork or piece of writing is. And similarly, if anyone had an experience like me of fainting upon hearing about her passing, I would also be very, very interested to know. So I didn't get to interview the Iranian-American novelist Porkista Kapoor, but she does say something in a conversation with Alyssa Harad that I think speaks for many of us. She says that Carrington gives Kapoor license to command her own selfhood among so many normals. So she provides a kind of model of niche interests, I think, and, you know, saying to us it's okay to be a bit eccentric and to be a pioneer years ahead of others before they're able to catch up with you. An interest in forefronting or making visible the experiences of older women was also another recurrent theme that I found. The need to vanquish ageism, so crucially important to our culture right now. The ability to kind of have a license or to paint and engage with more feminine narrative imagery was something which came across recurrently too. And just finally coming back to the notion of synchronicity, like many people pointed out that there was a kind of uncanny deja vu feeling when meeting or working with her. But just Sapinka said that the ghost of Leonora was already in the text before she even knew about her, which was very odd, very bizarre. And, you know, Lucy Scare seconds this when she said she absolutely knew she had to go and meet her, but she didn't understand why until she did, you know, to disassemble that kind of understanding of her practice. And if I can just share one more, the amazing novelist, Alyssa Harad, she claims Carrington and her work always appear in her life at times of great change and resistance to the status quo. Call it synchronicity or haunting, whatever it is, I've come to expect it, even to rely on it. And I think that's just a really beautiful way of putting it. I have many more examples and quotes, but I think those are really strong examples of what she brings to us.
It's just so fascinating to me. Thank you so much, Catriona. And it's good to hear about Elisa, who I love. I think she's in the audience. So, okay, I'm going to go back to Susan. Sorry, I'm just asking a question in a pendulum fashion. Susan, I wanted to ask you this. So Leonora lived in Mexico, which is a place I love very much, and I'm sure a lot of people love it. Breton used to say that it was the most surrealist place, like I learned that from her, like absolutely true experience many times. I was wondering how much in touch she was with indigenous spiritual practices, like shamanism or different currents of folk magic, like there is still actively now in Mexico, and also this healing practice, which I found so fascinating, called curanderismo. I was wondering what was the input of that in her experience or in her work.
I think everyone knows that Carrington used to go frequently to something called the Sonora Witches Market. It's one of these large outdoor markets in Mexico City where indigenous people sell herbs specifically for healing, as you said, as part of the healing practices. But it was also a place of witchcraft, of mediums, of all kinds of divinations, which she believed in, and she went there frequently. And it was run by women, as marketplaces usually are in Mexico. In addition to that, she would leave Mexico City and go into indigenous communities and study firsthand with the shamans there. They respected her. She spoke with them. But also, and I think this gets neglected, she was very interested, especially in the 50s and 60s, in the use of hallucinogens, in peyote and other drugs. So this is nothing different. Her friend Aldous Huxley was interested in that, as were other surrealists like Arcq. And so she was actually one of the earliest people who explored these practices with her friend Remedio Savado. And I'm going to do something a little naughty because we're running out of time. I can see here but I was going to just address a few of the questions to me in the chat. And I'm going to say one of the questions was the person wanted to know more about Carrington and Jodorowsky. And that is a very interesting story. I do outline their relationship in the Tarot book extensively, but he also writes about her. And if you want to read firsthand his impressions of her, you can go to any number of his books, including his famous Tarot book, but also his biography. Another question is, were there any other books in her library besides Levi? Yes, she had an extensive occult library. Now, this included Kurt Seligman's The Mirror of Magic, but also a large array of more historic books on the practice of magic, and I have outlined all for you in the book. And finally, was she interested in theosophy? Absolutely. She read Madame Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and a number of her other publications. So again, she was very knowledgeable about all avenues of esotericism.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to have a peek in our library too. Like, it's just so fascinating. One more question to you, Catriona. And so I wanted to know how did Leonora engage with the intersection of ecology and feminism during her lifetime, and how those themed in her work allow us to reflect on those topics today?
I mean, this is something I'm still working on, Laeticia, so I'm very happy to answer this one. I mean, firstly, the feminist ecosystem of Leonora is, again, all-encompassing, and certainly the intersectional politics, which come across most strongly from those that I interviewed. Again, I think the Arites family have been some of the greatest inheritors of this legacy through their Group of 100, which was a group in Mexico City, which was founded in 1985. Carrington was a signatory for that. And now we have Writers Rebel, which is a cultural facet of the Extinction Rebellion movement, and that was co-founded by Louis Arites. We also see an environmental awareness quite distinctively in the Dictionary of Animal Languages by Heidi Sapinka, and the eco-farming and land acknowledgement in the work of Double-Edged Theatre. Not to mention other examples like the vegetable ecologies and cabbage dances of the choreographer Michelle Mann, who's also interviewed in the book. Secondly, you've asked about how this figures in her own work. We can see the practical application of Carrington's artwork as a set of kind of green guidelines by which to live ethically, responsibly. The notion of rewilding, for example, I think comes across quite strongly. There's a de-anthropocentrism at play, which seeks to work in harmony with the non-human. And if I can just recommend any of Christopher Noenden's writings on this matter, he's a very, very good writer on this topic. So Carrington speaks quite powerfully to contemporary cultural concerns about the climate crisis and animal rights, and these issues are very much at the forefront of her creative purpose almost from day one. You know, again, Tere Arcq claims that she already had an ecological consciousness since she was a young girl, creating those kind of alternative fantasy islands and fantasy bestiaries in her jotter or sketchbook. So it's an awareness we see all the way through. I think it's particularly strong in the 1970s, when we have the kind of green feminism starting to come through. It's manifesting itself pronouncedly through the kind of women's liberation movement in the form of women's awareness, mujeres conciencia. So what Susan and Tere talk about really beautifully as a kind of feminist consciousness coming to the fore. There's of course the poster of 1972, which Susan showed in her presentation, and the essay Carrington writes, Female, Human, Animal as well. So it's become quite crucial to how we understand her now, you know, as a sort of form of natural magic and sort of sense of natural witchcraft.
So fascinating. It's also like such a, I mean, like, this is something that I've not completely explored in her work. You know, like, I was more, you know, interested in the esoteric aspect of her work, and I'm slowly kind of like diving into it. I found that just so fascinating, and your book deep dive in it in a way that I found really, really fascinating. Catriona, I know you had some question for Susan.
I absolutely have a question for Susan. So I'm itching to ask you two things very quickly, Susan. One is about the tarot research that you and Tere have been doing, and it's brought so many interesting Carrington artworks to light. But every time you publish, there seems to be like a new gem. What can you tell us about this as researchers and curators? You know, how do we find more Carringtons, and how do you negotiate access to private collection?
I don't know how this happens. And here's just my ideas about it. In her lifetime, Carrington did not get the exposure she wanted. And she was very prolific. She was an extremely hard worker. She painted all the time. And she gave away a lot of works to her friends, to her colleagues along the way. And now they've probably been sitting in closets or on walls, and now the children are looking at them and coming to grips with what they are. And they always contact either myself or mostly Tere for valuations, authenticities. When we interview her friends, and again, they're dying out now, they often will have notes, and that's how we discovered some of these diagrams. I think many more will come to light, actually. So this is not the end. I have a feeling it's only the beginning.
Because I remember hearing, Wendi, you wrote in your Story of the Last Egg catalogue about there being something like 1,500 artworks. So it'd be amazing to know if there are even more. Leti, can I ask Susan one more very, very quick question? Susan, I'm so fascinated in this image, the moon card, especially the scorpion that appears in the moon card, because Lucy Scare has a work called Scorpion/Diamond, and it's a juxtaposition, it's a kind of action on an Amsterdam street. She abandoned the two objects to their fate. I just wondered if that was maybe a representation of that card. I've seen the scorpion several times, and I just wondered if there was a particular meaning behind it.
That is not a scorpion, Catriona. That is, I don't know what you would call it, crayfish, a lobster, some kind of fishy, looks like a scorpion, but it's not actually. It's a aquatic creature coming out of the unconscious depths of the waters. Yes, it looks like a scorpion, but it's a different kind of a creature.
It has a fish tail, not a stinger.
Yes, a little fish tail. So that's what that is. And that is kind of part of tarot, traditional tarot imagery, I believe. So here's an interesting question in light of your experience of double-edged theater. Everywhere, people are producing her plays. She was a great playwright. They're producing her plays, and I think it's challenging. They are not normal types of theatrical productions. What are some of the challenges that you see in putting on these?
A really interesting question, Susan. Thank you. I should say I was fortunate to attend the outdoor Leonora's World in person in 2019, but my experience of The Magician and the Teacher was a live rehearsal, but it was via the Zoom lens because lockdown had taken place by then. I found both productions extremely extraordinary and otherworldly. The use of stairs in the indoor production was very powerful. You have that kind of idea of the house opposite as a theatrical stage, which was very exciting to me. And the opportunity to experience a Carringtonian soundscape and kind of polyphonic chant was amazing too. The outdoor experience was really authentic for me because of its use of trapeze and stilt work. And it kind of brought to life her painterly figures through costume and performance, and those sets were really immersive for me. I mean, they grew a labyrinth and harnessed the trapeze above the pond, and they built the crocodilo boat. So I think this is really committed work, and it's a real sense of kind of seasonal longevity and maintenance that's required to make that sort of thing happen. But your question about accessibility is really interesting to me too, because the audiences were supplied with a mood board to start with, a map of the site to take them around, and people were encouraged to wander. Yes. And the director also, I think, gave a short introduction at the beginning to provide some context before we set off. So it was interpreted as an exhibition might be, which I think helped massively for those who might not be as initiated into the kind of Carrington universe. And of course, these productions lend themselves to the Carrington scholar, but I think you can still learn something from that body of work if you didn't already know anything about her. I suppose the biggest challenge that I encountered was time. My eyes were hungry and night was falling. So it all seemed to be happening very, very suddenly, and everyone else seemed to be quite happy with the pace, but I definitely could have lingered for longer with certain encounters. It's the curse of being an art historian, I think. And it's, of course, the beauty is if I'd seen it twice, I would have had a completely different encounter because you could map it differently if you wanted to. So there were multiple ways in which you could encounter the spectacles that were on display. And of course, Carrington was a theatre maker herself. So she kind of, well, Stacey Klein's kind of continuing that tradition and that aspect of her practice.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you both that question. It's a question from Jerry O'Brien, who's asking, I'm going to ask both of you, why not? Did Leonora Carrington had any connection with 20th century composers or specific piece of music of any kind of dovetail? Did any piece of music kind of dovetail with her work? Apparently Jerry has a radio show and he's interested in knowing if there is any musical layers here.
Yes. Do you know who it's with? I'm forgetting his name, but she wrote an opera with someone. And if you email me, I will give you all the particulars to that production. Do you remember who it is, Catriona?
Top of my head, no. It sounds very, very familiar though. I feel like we were just discussing this with someone.
I have it somewhere. And so please feel free to email me at Bard College and I'll get back to you.
I was just going to add that I interviewed 2 musicians for the book, and one of them is Clara Engel and the other is Michael Begg, and both of them have worked on Carrington from a more audio perspective. So I think that's really, really nice to see as well, kind of just broadening the scope of what Carrington might be.
Maybe one last question. I don't know. I think we have time for one last. Dr. Kate Lady is asking, is there a possibility that the archives of her writing will be open to more scholars?
What do you mean about the archives of her writing?
I don't know. I don't know. Is it easy to access her, I guess, her personal archive? Is there like I know that there is the Leonora Carrington estate. Is it something that scholar can request to see, or how does that? It's not my question.
The Stone Door, which is such an important novella, is being reprinted now, has been out of print for a very long time. It will be out in 2023. Also brand new is a wonderful collected volume of Carrington's plays and theatrical works edited by Carla Segura. And I believe that's either out or coming out very soon. I think it's out already. There is a museum in Mexico City in Carrington's home that apparently has some archival material in it. I have not been fortunate enough to visit it. What about you, Catriona?
No, I haven't. I mean, we've been to the National Library together, haven't we? And there was meant to be a sort of handover at that point. So I'm not sure where that's got to, but I understood that some of the papers were eventually going to end up there.
Well, I think this is it for us. Do you have any last comments, invitation you want to give to give people some things to research, maybe some blessings before the end of the evening?
Well, I haven't been to the Madrid show, but I've got the catalogue and it's absolutely stunning. So the work continues, which is really nice to see.
And I guess I just want to say, happy birthday, Leonora. I know you're on the other side and I know you're here listening and thinking God knows what. And I wish we were eating dinner together at Sanborn's, her favorite restaurant in Mexico City. But I know in her lifetime, she wanted to be more greatly appreciated. And so I know she'd be very happy today with the interest that everyone is showing, not only in her work, but in the important messages in her work about the social action necessary to move into a future.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Catriona. Please go and get those books and do yourself the treat of reading them back to back. Thank you again to you too. Thank you to Wendi and everyone in the gallery team. And I hope everyone should go and read cards in their kitchen tonight in honor of Leonora. I think this is what I'm going to do personally. Have a great evening and hopefully see you very soon. Have a great night.